With that, we will then go on to our final section, which is about gravitational fields. And we can start here with Steve Thorne. Now, Steve is the founder of the Copernican Project, a non-profit organization centered in, I think it's Berkeley, isn't it? Not Berkeley, Berkeley, California, which is investigating a possible coupling between metabolic processes and strain effects generated by periodicity in gravitational potential due to Earth's orbital motion. This is something completely different, and we're looking forward to this. Steve, over to you for, you've got about 11 minutes or so. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Hey, this has been fantastic today. And it's funny, gravitation is the odd man out here because it's been left out of Maxwell's equations. It's been left out of quantum mechanics. And of course, it's been left out of almost all biology books, such as this that we went through. And so the goal of the Copernican Project that I'm involved with is to demonstrate how the gravitational forces that organize the stars and the planets also play or appear to play a critical role in biology. And we also argue that physics has as much to learn, when looking through books and stuff like this. Physics makes approximations to so many of our theories, and we sort of average over effects that you guys, biologists, look for. And that's not my background in the biology. We're trying to catch up. And actually now after 5 years, it's just fascinating to look at these correlations. But we want to remind people that if I were to wind up a bag of springs and chemicals and toss them across the room, that it's not the electromagnetic equations or the biochemical equations that govern its destiny. It's the gravitational equations in the long term. And that all electromagnetic interactions that you've been discussing today, they carry with it this little nonlinear background. And it's just a small bias. And it's unique because electromagnetic forces, and they can cancel each other out. But gravitation has a bias to it. It's much like in a casino when you're playing poker and the house comes by and just takes a few dollars out of the pot out of every hand. No one really cares when you're betting high stakes numbers like electromagnetic interactions. But in the end of the day, it makes a difference. So if I get the time, I hope to show that some of these oscillations, that they connect with Clausius's virial equation that's at the basis of thermodynamics, and that possibly it gives insight into temperature oscillations and in mammals and in thermoregulation. So with that, let's go forward. Okay, so just a few quick lessons from space. And that ultimately metabolic order is intimately coupled to our inertial state. And I'll explain that in a little bit, or I'll review it. But ultimately, when we go to space, we're bringing the same bag of chemicals and the same interactions. All we're changing is our inertial state. And then the second point is that the inertial state of all organisms residing on Earth's surface, it's not static, but instead it's oscillating, okay? And to the natural strain cycles produced by Earth's spin, wobble, and its orbital motion. And that these periodicities and the energy exchange, this is what's fascinating, tend to correlate with the natural periodicities of orbital motion. So metabolic periodicities can be directly connected to some of these orbital dynamics if we can find, and that's a collective we, because this is in really the gray area of so many fields, if we can find the way to couple them together. So this is a wonderful picture because it shows, it's the star track of the night sky over Nepal. And what it is, it's a reminder of our motion, because the motion is not in the stars, of course, it's in us. And that we are all rotating, and every molecule is rotating and spinning in this very precise way. And if we could capture this photo over a month, we would see this beautiful little 28-day cycle in this. And again, that cycle's not in the stars, but it's in us, and it underlies all of our chemical reactions. Now, NASA is familiar with that. It introduces this bias into all systems. And NASA, that's why they launched to the east. It's because the Earth is spinning that way. And I know that's funny to think about as we sit here and everything in the east-west looks the same, but it's not. There's a slight energy bias, and just possibly it's being wound into our biological environment. So let's review a little bit what I mean by inertial state. What I mean collectively, it's this state of all of our accelerations and our velocities, and then there are these higher derivatives of motion, okay? And by oscillating gravitational fields, we're not talking about gravitational waves and those exotic, real fine scale elements. What we're talking about is just oscillations in our potential that we all experience, and we just forget about. So if we look at this diagram, one of the first things you can notice is that the little dash yellow line, that represents our orbit. And the center of the Earth does not orbit the sun. It's our barycenter of the Earth-Moon. And what that does, it's going to introduce this 28-day periodicity. It's a million times more precise than a Rolex. But we also exhibit this oscillation back and forth in the sun's gravitational field. Between noon and midnight, it's not trivial. We move 6 times 10 to the 24th, 6 times 10 to the 6th is the radius of the Earth. So we move twice that in the frame of the sun. But we also accelerate and decelerate. So if you look at the diagram here at noon, when we're close to the sun, and actually the rotation of the Earth's surface that we're bound to. So all of your electromagnetic fields and these spins, we're all bound to the Earth's surface. And as we're spinning, we are moving at 465 meters per second away from our velocity, and 465 meters per second with the velocity of the orbit. So between noon and midnight, we actually accelerate by about 1,000 meters per second. And that's about 4 times as fast as a jet airplane. And it's not just our collective system, it's every molecule, it's every nuclei that's bound by this electron environment has to be accelerated that way. Most importantly, though, we just see that there's these oscillations that are occurring, and they can't be shielded. They're experienced by all life on Earth. So what's interesting about it then, if that's the case, if it is being wound into our system, then you expect it to show up in our metabolism. So here's some fascinating correlations, and they're just correlations. We don't call them causations, because like any sets of numbers that you can find correlations, but these are particularly fascinating because they have to do with metabolism and then this cycle. So our basal metabolic rate, it turns out for a person of 68 kilograms, an average person, that they need, just as from a basal level, a diet of about 1,000 to 1,600 calories. It's not a precise number, the formula is not. But the physics of change of our motion within the gravitational field is that between noon and midnight, we're shoved like any other force. When you're lifting against a gravitational field, it requires work. That work has to be exerted from the electric field to get that mass of every nucleon shoved away from the sun. The energy change between noon and midnight is about 1,075 calories. And so if you look at those two numbers, they fall right into each other's range. And that's an interesting coincidence, so that our basal metabolic rate is roughly equal to the change in gravitational potential energy that has power through our system. So let's move forward to a related correlation that's even more fascinating given today's discussions. And that is that if you add up all of the high energy plus and minus reactions that are occurring in your body along all those metabolic pathways, the high energy ROS exchanges, we've got the Krebs cycle, we've got electron transports, electrons being shoved down those potentials. We've got, of course, the protons being shoved across membranes, and those are billions and billions of times stronger than the gravitational field, of course. But at the end of the day, those numbers cancel, and what we're left with is our metabolism still happens to correlate roughly with the simple change in the gravitational potential number. That is, that delta E of our metabolism roughly changes, equates to the delta U. And that's just a fascinating correlation. And what's even then if we take that deeper investigation into then our metabolic numbers related to ATP, the unit of energy in the cell, that the energy released by hydrolysis is roughly 28 to 57 kilojoules per mole. And the energy change that is felt by the mass of an ATP molecule as it moves from one side of the earth to the other is 36 kilojoules per mole. So here again, we have a force that's billions and billions times weaker, and yet it happens to express itself pretty coincidentally in our energy numbers. And then system-wide, this was a study done in 2008. And this is a correlation between almost all life forms on Earth. And they did it, this was a group of physicists and biologists, and they studied 3,000 species from a little prokaryote to an elephant. And they found that metabolism organized into a very narrow range. And that's the two dash lines, the dark dash lines. And if we plot the gravitational potential energy change per unit mass, it falls right into that lower level. And what that suggests to us is that maybe these little nonlinear gravitational wiggles and wobbles of that, remember those oscillations, they're just getting things stirred up for then our metabolism to organize. And it's like a starter motor in a car, they're waiting for then the higher energy chemicals to kick in. So there's a connection to what then might be a justification for the minimum mass of an enzyme if you extend this conjecture forward, is that if these strains are somehow being wound into electromagnetic fields of molecules, they're useless by themselves. We accelerate between every carbon atom accelerates gains of kinetic energy of about 3.5 electron volts between noon and midnight. That doesn't do anything. I'm sorry, let me back up. That's the kinetic energy. The potential energy that it gains if it's wound into a molecule is about 100th of an electron volt. We would need about 3,600 carbon masses or Daltons, I should say, in order to modify a carbon bond. And by coincidence, the minimum mass of an enzyme happens to fall into that same range. So if we look more deeply, there seems to be a thermodynamic correlation, possibly with Clausius's virial theorem. And we won't go into the math now, but it's fundamental to all of thermodynamics. It's the basis, classical and quantum mechanics adhere to it. And it applies to all these molecular activity. And all it says is that, hey, everything is too complicated to define these electronic states. But on average, over time, they're going to cancel each other out. And what you're left with is about half the change in the gravitational potential energy. And then what one expects, of course, is that, well, hey, we're moving not only relative to the sun, but we're moving relative to the moon. And that has a 28-day periodicity. So we might expect then these metabolic pathways that are managing this little nonlinear effect, just sort of this little carrier that comes with all these chemical reactions, that maybe they will have a periodicity of 24 hours and then 28 days, or roughly. And again, this just another correlation, but our temperature does oscillate between noon and midnight, and there is a rough temperature change in our metabolism. And if you look on the bottom set of diagrams, that's the relative position of the moon between its closest and each month between its furthest and closest position. And that oscillation is the change in the gravitational field. And there's an insect called the midge, and biologists have found that gene expression in the midge oscillates over a 28-day period. And that's not an easy thing to maintain with just chemical organization alone. And so what our group is doing is we're going to try to now find these effects in very subtle ways in 3 sets of experiments, which I won't go through. And Jeffrey, I'll close this quickly. But one of the interesting ones we call Chronos, and a couple of the members listening today are part of. But we're going to look for variations in cell growth patterns associated with inertial differences that are coupled to our latitude. Because as we move and spin with the Earth, that the inertial state oscillates a little bit different whether you're further north or further south. And the little diagram on the right shows some of the variations we might expect. And I'll stop there.
Real food for thought, actually. Fascinating. It's some of these things are like that little stirrer in the space shuttle that went wrong. Small things lead to larger things. Alistair, can I just reintroduce Alistair? At this point, Dr. Sawyer, who's the director of the UC Space Health at University of California, was due to give a talk to us. So Alistair has very, very kindly overnight prepared a presentation, not on her slides, but from the title of her talk. So if we give Alistair a little bit of leeway on this one, good luck.
Okay, hi. Does that come up all right?
Yeah, we got it.
Yeah, okay, right. Yes, thanks very much. Yes, so Jeffrey has explained what's happened. Yes, I've just taken the title in the last minute, 10 minutes or so. I'll just try and go through it and try and link quite a few of the things that we've talked about today. Just to go through it again. The talk here was about the effects of microgravity on life, and certainly one of the things we've got to remember is that life evolved at 1G. And certainly without technology or a very large asteroid, life is unlikely to ever leave the surface and survive, although see next point. And it seems that certainly from evidence is that certainly very simple organisms like prokaryotes can survive in space and evolve. But for complex organisms, this seems to be much more difficult. And certainly when you consider some of Steve's theories as well, it seems that if we want to travel in space, certainly with the gravity, we're going to have to either induce some form of artificial gravity like centrifugal or centripetal, or indeed get so far down the road of unifying all the various forces to actually develop an electronic version of artificial gravity, which I think that's a very long way off. And certainly we've also got very little data on the very long-term effects of astronauts when they come back to Earth. And I was quite surprised by this reading through some of the data, but it seems that there's only been about 500 or so people who've been in space. And we haven't really followed them for very, very long. Somebody, Afshin, might be able to speak to that. But it seems that, over 20 years, though, what has happened to these people over 20 years? So there's quite a lot we don't know. But certainly, I think most of you will appreciate what happens in this space. Certainly, we get motion sickness. There's a very quick loss of muscle mass. And as it turns out, a shift in the fiber type from slow to fast. There's a loss of bone, and astronauts get taller, which is quite interesting. There's a weakening of the cardiovascular system and reduced red blood cells, and our balance starts to go a bit funny, and our eyesight goes funny as well. The eyeballs change shape, and apparently there's also lots of dust floating around in the space station, and that also affects the sight. And then there are also taste and immune changes, and certainly there's clear from a lot of pictures there's fluid imbalance. Of course, there's no gravity acting on the fluid system, and so astronauts tend to get puffy faces, and this is also related to sinus problems. They tend to get insomnia. There's also a lot of evidence of abdominal pain and problems with the guts. Because of course your guts have spent their entire life being pulled down at 1G, and indeed there's a lot of internal sort of wiring to hold the guts in the right place. And of course this probably links into things like the microbiota as well, but certainly gas problems and there are other general GI effects. There's also reduced resistance to pathogens, and there's some evidence of cognitive problems which may be related to increase in intracranial pressure. And something I didn't know, which because skin starts to become more friable and damaged, and you get dermal atrophy and dysregulated hair follicle cycles. So in general, it's not a very favourable place. So from my perspective, and this is where I'm going to probably differ, I don't know what Dr. Dyer was going to talk about, but I'm going to dig a little bit deeper. And having gone into the literature, it certainly seems that in multicellular organisms anyway, that gravisensors have evolved, which enable cells to cooperate. And certainly some very old biology, which has been long known, is that one of the proteins involved is these things called the integrins, which are are basically proteins which go from the inside of the cell to the outside, and they link the inside and the outside, and they have slight inside-out signaling, and they link to the cytoskeleton. And there has been some descriptions of what seem to be kind of super complex. And now one of the descriptions of these is something called the matriosome. And this is a whole group of proteins which seem to come together, and they're very important in detecting changes in torsion, compression, and tension. And this has been highlighted by Barakova, and it also involved in controlling the release of soluble proteins like growth factors. And certainly when studied from the space perspective, these things start to give out strange signals. We get an increase in protease activity, there's shifts in the extracellular matrix. And certainly in some astronauts, this could be related to activation of the acute phase response, which is obviously a stress response. And certainly one of the most fundamental pathways in the body, the extracellular kinase pathway, seems to be modulated. And this also seems to come out in terms of how cells adhere to things. Now, obviously, life evolved at 1G, and it seems that cells are very, cells have to adhere to things in order to grow. And this involves a very complex bunch of biology involving integrins, immunoglobulins, caveolins. And the interesting thing is that gravity affects cell adhesion. If you reduce gravity or go to microgravity, cells tend to fall off a plate and they start to apoptose, which is suggesting something. And then this happens very quickly. And certainly this could affect wound healing. And certainly there's evidence that wound healing is slowed down. Now, there's another paper I found, and this may be, I think the physicists in here probably do better than I will on this one. There's something tensegrity, and I'm sorry, I don't know if I pronounce it right. As suggested, the cytoskeleton, and this is something absolutely critical in modern cells, is key in detecting the gravitational force. And a description of this is that tensegrity is a design principle that applies when a discontinuous set of compression elements is opposed and balanced by a continuous tensile force, thereby creating an internal free stress that stabilizes the entire structure. And this is used in engineering to build structures, but cells seem to be using the same principles. And this is suggesting, therefore, that cells detect changes in gravitational force right through from the very large organs all the way down right to the molecular level. And the key point about this is that a loss of stress, i.e. take away gravity, induces a loss of geometrical configuration. And this kind of makes the point that actin and the cytoskeleton are very key in detecting gravitational changes. And so taking this on board, it seems that organisms kind of experience this acute distress and slight disorganization. And this can certainly affect gene function. And this could certainly seem to affect the brain and neurons, can result in cognitive problems. This is reviewed by Gardner. And it's also associated with activation of things like the endolysosomal system and oxidative stress. Again, as you might expect, the cell's responding to some kind of stress and it's trying to adapt. And interestingly enough, it also might affect bacterial functioning. Now, this is a very early days, but of course, people obviously understand that bacteria will also respond to radiation, but it might be they might actually also respond to gravity changes. But critically, and this is, I know there's been quite a lot of research in this, bursts of hypergravity, so like a centrifuge, can actually offset some of these effects, which suggests one possible way that astronauts might be able to keep their health of being spun up into a slightly higher, say, 2 gravities in a kind of centrifuge to offset some of these effects. Now, of course, this brings us back to where we're very interested, and I'm sorry for going back to mitochondria again. But of course, mitochondria and the cytoskeleton in modern cells are very intimately tied together. And this would suggest that any changes in gravity will very quickly affect this axis. And this is just taken from a review paper. And we know that, for instance, mitochondria, they travel around inside your cell all the time. There's this biological area of field research called mitochondrial dynamics. And certainly in neurons, mitochondria are going up and down the cytoskeleton all the time. And it's a two-way traffic. The cytoskeleton is important for moving mitochondria, but the mitochondria also interact and change the effects on the cytoskeleton. And if we take this into even more detail, the cytoskeleton in every cell is composed of components of tubulin, for instance, and these can exist as monomer or a polymer. And this is a very dynamic process, but there is a very key molecule in the outer membrane of the mitochondria called VDAC, which is the voltage-dependent ion channel. And this interacts with tubulin, and certainly there's a lot of evidence that this changes, for instance, in cancer. But of course, this suggests that any change in the polymerization of say, the cytoskeleton can have an effect on mitochondrial function. And indeed, people have been looking at this, for instance, in peripheral neuropathy, where certain types of chemotherapy alter this relationship, and certainly cancer cells may be using this. It's also very important in cardiac cell function, as Wendy pointed out. This interaction could indeed be critical to maintain the architecture of the heart. And back to some of the work that Mike Levine was talking about, there's a link here, of course, with ion channels in the cytoskeleton, and we know that inflammation also alters this relationship. And certainly from our perspective, where we've been interested in insulin resistance and obesity, this is certainly something which has been looked into. For instance, alterations in the relationship between the cytoskeleton and mitochondria can induce insulin resistance. So there's a whole pile of these things which indicating relationship between the cytoskeleton and the mitochondrial function. Now, of course, as Mikhail pointed out, we know that pulse electric fields can modulate the cytoskeleton interaction and indeed modulate respiration. And this goes all the way back to, of course, Froelich and his idea of the condensates and this vibronic resonance between the mitochondrial electric field and the cytoskeleton. And of course, much more recently, of course, is the work of Philip Curian and Salado looking at the superradiance effects in microtubules. So there's quite a good link here to the field theories. And so, of course, this raises a very interesting point, and this was raised briefly earlier on about, well, is when we go into space, are changes in cellular metabolism adaptive or non-adaptive or pathological? And as Jeffrey pointed out, I think this could potentially be high, it's all down to dose. The truth is that all organisms will try and adapt and survive. This is a fundamental life prerogative, but they can only go so far. And this is just a diagram from one of our papers, but showing it's possible that, for instance, if we evolved at 1G, which is around here in the middle diagram, if you go to hypergravity, you induce stress, which can induce an adaptive response. But what happens when you go the other way? And I think it's something that life has probably not been exposed to. And one of the things that may come out of this is the possibility that when you go into space, it may well depend partly on how fit and healthy you are. And as someone's pointed out, often most astronauts are actually athletes. They're very, very healthy. But of course, when we start thinking about, space tourism, one has to think, well, what happens there? And so, of course, this brings us back to the idea of the quantum mitochondrial gravity canary. Any change in the cytoskeleton is going to interact with the mitochondria. And if there are quantum effects going on relating to both tunneling, coherence, and spin, of course, this could induce adaptation. But if it goes too far, does it result in pathology, i.e. the cell detects it as inflammation and oxidative stress? And I was just watching Wendy's thing, and something clicked in my mind. We know that the HSP70 is actually turning out to be critical ATPase assembly, which I think Wayne could probably talk to. But it's also been long known that this HSP70 has been important in protecting mitochondria against hypoxia. And of course, it's clear that mitochondria themselves can act as next sense of ROS, suggesting that they play an absolutely critical role in a reactive oxygen signaling and obviously redox. So I think all of these things do seem to lead together, which I think brings us on very neatly to our discussion. So that I'll finish. Thank you very much.
Alistair, thank you very much indeed. I'm reminded that I think it was Mark Twain who said, "I'm sorry I wrote you such a long letter. I didn't have time to write you a short one." And thank you so for putting that together overnight. What is interesting to think about from today, and I don't know how many people would share this view, is we titled today's session as "What Can Terrestrial Health Learn from Space?" And that's sort of from space medicine, that predisposes that as with other research projects, if you're looking at an illness that is chronic, you try to find an example of it where it's acute, so that you can cut down the length of time to do your research. So if you want to research slow viruses, which take 30 years to have their effect, you don't really want to be looking at that. You want to look at something quicker. And it seems to me that space provides for us, or space astronauts going space and further space travel will provide for us some models, some very good models of accelerated processes. And we've said perhaps it's accelerated aging, it might be accelerated adaptation. And it's interesting that the whole human's ability to adapt may be less potent than, say, the microbiome in our gut, for example. So after long periods in space. Say if one wanted to send a man to Mars, one wonders what would get off at the other end. Would it be the human or just a large blob of adjusted gut microbiome, for example? I don't think we subject any humans on Earth to these risks in their role and in their job. And it seems to me that it's imperative that these observations we've made, Asfan's got a phenomenal amount of information that they've looked at. Alistair, just after 24 hours of looking at it, rolled out a dozen or so pathologies which would give you concern about anybody on Earth. And it seems to me, I wonder, and perhaps I could ask the space biologists here, why has this not alarmed you? And why is it that we're considering technologies to take humans way away from Earth when our understanding of what might happen to them seems to be less than basic at present? Is man trapped on Earth? And if he is, we need to know that pretty damn quickly before we waste too much time and money designing devices to take man into space, when you probably, by the time you get to it, you might as well send a machine